My name is Ethan, but my friends and family call me Etho. Yes, I know it sounds a bit weird, that nickname, but my friends in the village think it's funny. I live in a small town in the south of England, famous for its cheddar cheese production. Back in the early 2000s, I had a good friend called Liam. We had known each other since we were 6 or 7 years old, and we both shared a love of Dragon Ball Z, wrestling, video games, and being a bit of an outsider. It's not that we were weird or anything, we just didn't fit in too much with the other good kids in town. But Liam and I had more than that in common. We actually both came from non-traditional families. I was raised by my grandparents and my dad, and he was raised by his aunt and uncle. Neither of us had a conventional family, and in a small traditionalist town like ours, that marks you a little bit. People judge you by who you hang out with, for better or worse. We got picked on for wearing Dragon Ball Z t-shirts to school, so imagine what it was like growing up. I lived in a cul-de-sac, more or less in the center of town, even though we were on top of a small hill. It was hard to describe if you had never been there, but from my house we had a beautiful panoramic view of the rest of the town. Liam would come over on weekends and summer vacations, and we would do typical kid stuff, playing games, fighting on the trampoline, climbing the hill behind my house, rollerblading, playing video games, and watching Dragon Ball Z that couldn't be missing from our list of fun activities. In short, nothing out of the ordinary until one summer night that changed our lives forever. It was late June, so the days were long and hot. We were outside chatting, probably about which girl we both liked, or if our favorite wrestler would win the championship, when we saw something that I can only describe as the crucifixion of someone our age. There's no other way to put it. From my house, we could see another hill, about 100 yards away. That area was like a little town on its own, with a private school, a little store, a church, everything a small town in this area would have. Nobody in town, not even me, had much contact with the people in that area. We were always told to mind our own business when it came to them. But what we witnessed that day changed things for both of us drastically. As I was saying, Liam and I were outside when we heard screams that sounded like someone our age, which was about 14 or 15 years old. The screams seemed to be coming from the hill on the other side, so we immediately looked over, and that's when we saw a blonde boy tied to a makeshift cross, while 2 adults were whipping him with huge whips. Liam and I were completely frozen, petrified at what we were looking at. We looked at each other with our eyes almost out of their sockets from how shocked we were, and he said, "Are you seeing it?" While I was still mute with shock, I couldn't utter a word, so I just nodded my head. We didn't know what to think or what to do. We watched the chilling scene for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. The boy's screams grew louder with each lash. The lashes were so strong that we could hear the impact on the poor boy's skin. It was so brutal and horrible that it made me want to vomit. Liam and I couldn't take it anymore and ran into the house. We told my grandfather everything, looking like maybe he could do something, but he told us to mind our own business and mind our own business. How could we ignore something like that? It was grotesque. My grandfather assured us that the boy had only been tied up and would be taken down after punishment. Liam and I were completely horrified. No one was going to do anything for that boy. Besides, we had so many questions. My grandfather explained to us that there were some very strange people living there who followed a branch of the Catholic Church that seemed more like a cult or a sect than a normal religion. That afternoon, Liam and I preferred to stay indoors to play video games, just to avoid looking up the hill. Years later, I learned that this religious group was so radical that the Catholic Church had banned and excommunicated them. My grandmother also told us that she knew some people of that religion, and they were so rare that the authorities didn't even mess with them. The punishment of crucifixion had become normal, and people just accepted it because, well, the authorities in these small towns didn't really care. And it seemed that these extremists' right to freedom of worship, had given them all the legal impunity they needed to commit such inhumane acts without having to answer for them to the authorities. That made me think about how vulnerable children and teenagers were in that community. That night, my grandmother made us muffins and gave us permission to play video games until late. She advised us to try to forget what we had seen, but of course, at our age, it was impossible to erase those images from our minds. Later that night, while playing Pokemon Stadium on my Nintendo 64, Liam, ever the daring one, suggested that we go to that hill one night to see how weird those people were. I didn't want to at first, because I honestly dreaded it, but Liam eventually convinced me. Besides, most of the time we were pretty bored, so I reluctantly agreed, hoping that it was just one of those many passing ideas that came up from time to time, and that we would never actually do it. A couple of days later, Liam and I were walking and chatting, not too worried that anything bad might happen, when suddenly the subject of the crucified boy came up again, and then Liam suggested that we go up that hill and have a look for ourselves. It was about 8 p.m. at that time, and I wasn't at all convinced that this was a good idea, but in the end I agreed. You know, we were young, and the idea sounded interesting, or at least it was a way to escape the boredom of the town. Liam asked his aunt and uncle if he could stay over at my house that day, and they said yes, so the plan was set in motion. My grandparents were going to bed early, about 9 or 10 p.m., so we waited for them to fall asleep before we left. It would be 10:30 when we snuck out of my house, trying not to make noise, and we were carrying a couple of backpacks with water and some snacks and, of course, flashlights, because we didn't know how long we would be gone. The walk there took us about 20 minutes. We didn't see anyone, not a soul, not a single car, just the barking of some dog in the distance and the hooting of owls that made our hair stand on end. When we arrived, we found a small school, a building that looked like a store or something, and another that looked like a church. And there, in what appeared to be the backyard of the church, stood the cross, lonely and grim in the dim moonlight. It must have been the place you could see from my backyard, where they had that poor boy tied up and torturing him. Luam suggested we go over to take a look. We both had flashlights and shined them around the area to get a good look, and to our absolute horror, we saw what looked like 20 or 30 tombstones, all randomly arranged all over the yard. I can't lie, at that age, seeing that in the dark of night made us jump in fright. However, we wanted to act brave and move on. There was a huge tree right there, and Liam, with his little pocket knife that never left his side, said, "What if we made our mark?" I looked at him and was skeptical for a moment, but then I agreed and we got to work. Although it took longer than we thought it would, in the end, 2 perfect L's and a perfect E were carved into the huge trunk. But while we were admiring our work of art, we suddenly saw a small door in the church building, with a candle flickering next to it. It was ajar, so Liam pushed it open and it swung wide, then whispered to me to come inside and investigate. With the flashlights on, we went in quietly. Truth be told, I expected to find someone there after all, who leaves a church open in the middle of the night. But there wasn't a soul. The place was empty, which made it even creepier. We moved forward between the pews, and although it was strange, there was nothing that looked like a normal church. Not an image, not a saint, nothing. Just a huge cross hanging from the ceiling, which looked like it was going to fall down at any moment. The place was more an invitation to feel terror than to have faith. The place smelled strange, like rotten wood mixed with something metallic and smelly, like dried blood. It was hard to explain, just strange. There was a stained glass window, which was the closest thing to a normal church, but the figures there were not saints or anything recognizable. They looked more like cult followers. We browsed around for a few minutes until Liam yelled, "Etho, come quick, you have to see this." I ran to him immediately, and when I got to where he was, I found a huge box full of VHS tapes, all marked with red X's or blue circles. I asked Liam what he thought they were, but he had no idea. I guess our naivety helped, because nothing that I would think today when I saw a tape with several X's written on it crossed our minds at the time. But we immediately thought of taking one to see it. However, at that moment we heard a car stopped outside, although we saw no lights. We turned off our flashlights and hid near the altar. Then we heard a car door close. Someone was coming. "Maybe it's a cop," Liam suggested, and I prayed it was. Considering the place we were in, it was better to be found by the law than by the ball of psychos that seemed to inhabit that town. Just then, Tony said, "Let's go," and we ran out the way we had come in, jumping over the backyard fence near the tombstones. That's when we heard a deep, husky male voice shouting, "Get back here right now." I got goosebumps and my heart was pounding. I felt like throwing up, but the adrenaline kept Liam and I running at full speed. I don't think we had ever run so fast in our lives. I estimate it took us about 15 minutes to get to my house, running non-stop. Neither of us looked back once, and once there, we pulled into my grandfather's garage to catch our breath and process everything that had happened. "Who the hell was that?" my friend asked. "No idea," I replied. We both let out a bunch of expletives, trying to sound older and tougher than we really were. We looked around for signs of a car following us, but luckily we didn't see anything or anyone. But just then, my grandmother turned on the porch light and called out to me, "Ethan, are you out there?" I replied that yes, we were skating for a while. She then told us that it was too late for that and to go inside right now, so we obeyed. Before we went inside the house, we left our backpacks outside, although I couldn't shake the weird smell of the place. It was like a mixture of stagnant water, mold, and something metallic. Very strange and hard to describe. That night, neither of us got much sleep. We stayed up in my room until almost dawn, talking about what we had seen and trying to figure out what the hell was on those tapes. Who was that person who showed up with no lights on in their car? Why were the lights off at that hour? Did they know we were there? Why was the door open with the candle burning? And that weird smell, what was it? We had more questions now than before. We felt as if we had walked into a B horror movie. The next morning, my grandmother woke us up for breakfast. My grandparents usually ate breakfast on the deck during the summer, but Liam and I went out to the garage. We were still brooding about the night before, but instead of freaking out, we started laughing. It was a mixture of the unknown and that typical teenage attitude, trying to act tough. Liam and I never went back to that place again. But a few years later, there was a scandal in which a group of girls ran away from the town and denounced to the authorities the atrocities they were subjected to by the high church hierarchs. These girls denounced aberrant acts committed there. Among them, the physical and psychological torture and sexual abuse to which they were subjected by the church hierarchs and which were recorded and then exposed in the church itself, in secret meetings of the prophets, as the group of men who ran the church called themselves. They also spoke about the kind of inhumane punishments to which the children of the congregation were subjected, and the extreme psychological control exercised by the church over the adults, who practically had to hand over their children to the church and had no power over them. It was even known about several murders committed by these people, one of them being the boy we saw crucified that day, whose name turned out to be Patrick, and died because of all the torture he suffered that day. All the things that came to light about that site were chilling, to say the least. Fortunately, several of the so-called prophets were arrested and are now serving long prison sentences. Others unfortunately managed to escape. After this, the church was closed and demolished, and many residents of the town decided to leave. Today, only a few families remain in the place. But the sect was dissolved, or at least that is what is known. This was an experience I will never forget, something Liam and I talked about for years. Sadly, my friend Liam passed away in 2021, a victim of COVID-19. I miss him terribly, and writing this story today has felt a bit like bringing him back, like reliving him through memories, albeit a chilling one like this one. My name is Jeff. I'm 23 years old and I live in a quiet little town in Alabama. This story happened when I was 10 years old and living with my parents in a small condo. Almost every day I played outside with my neighborhood friends. We rode bikes, played soccer, stuff like that. I also watched a lot of horror movies and videos, so I always got paranoid when I was alone in a room or in the middle of the dark. The condo was shaped like a triangle, with a few rows of houses facing a long parking lot. There were usually 10 to 15 cars parked there, but sometimes there were only 2 or 3. The garbage truck came by every Thursday morning, around 8 o'clock or so. One Wednesday night around 9 or so, my 17-year-old sister and I were alone in the house, as my mother had gone out to dinner with her boyfriend and said she would be back late. I didn't get along very well with my sister. We were always fighting and arguing about everything, and that night was no exception. Her laptop had been damaged and she insisted on borrowing mine, but I was playing an online game and didn't want her to take it. But since my mother wasn't there to serve as a referee, she finally took my computer anyway. I left my room very angry, but in the end I decided to sit on the couch to watch TV. But about half an hour later, I saw out of the corner of my eye a figure standing outside the window. The windows of our condo were tall and rectangular, and looked out onto the joint parking lot. They were quite large, so you could clearly see everything going on outside. But anyone standing outside could also see inside the house, since the curtains my mom had bought were made of a transparent material that during the day let the sunlight in, but at night made the window into a sort of showcase that left the whole room exposed. As soon as I noticed the figure outside, I turned my head towards the window, scared, not knowing quite what to do. About 2 minutes passed in which I couldn't take my eyes off the window, waiting for something to happen. But this person, who I couldn't make out because of the darkness outside, just kept standing there looking out our window until he finally turned away. So I went back to watching TV. However, after a while, I saw this figure out of the corner of my eye again, but this time I could make out that it was an older gentleman, maybe in his 50s or so. He was staring at me as he walked with slow steps in front of my window. The man was basically doing nothing but staring, but when I saw him approach the window, I panicked, so I jumped off the furniture and ran to my sister's room to tell her what I had just seen. As expected, she ignored me and told me to go away and stop snooping around the windows. Exit to the room between angry, indignant, and scared. I walked to the living room again, but this time slowly and with my eyes glued to the window to see if the person was still there. Fortunately, he was no longer there, so I sat back down on the couch and continued watching the movie. About 15 minutes after I had seen the old man for the last time, the house phone rang. It was my mom, asking me to take out the trash so she wouldn't have to do it in the morning. I don't know why, but I decided not to tell her about the guy in the window. Probably because my sister had told me to stop being a whiny little kid who freaks out about everything, so I figured it was no big deal. So I decided to go out and throw out the garbage by myself and without telling my sister anything. So I grabbed all the garbage and recycling from all the neighbors and took it to the end of the parking lot where the dumpster was. It was almost winter, so it was already pitch dark. And by the way, some streetlights had been damaged in that area of the parking lot, and no one had come to repair them yet, so you could hardly see more than 10 feet away in that darkness. At 10 years old, I was still pretty scared to go out alone, and even more so if it was so dark. But I had to do it to prove to my sister that I was no crybaby. So I walked down the sidewalk, super scared, like every time I took out the garbage at night since the streetlights were damaged, and I noticed that night there were many cars parked. I absolutely hated it, as I was always afraid that someone would suddenly jump out from behind a car and do something to me. Kid stuff, right? But no, because at that instant, when I was coming back from throwing out the garbage, my worst nightmare came true. In the middle of the darkness, I could see a head peeking out between two cars less than 5 meters away from me. I could only see his wrinkled forehead and eyes, but I was sure it was the same old man as before. I stood totally paralyzed, staring at him with my heart racing and not knowing what to do. Then, the man spoke in what I would describe as a whisper, but loud and with a sickening smile on his lips. "Hey, come here, little guy. I have something you might like, just come and I'll show you. Don't be scared, I just want to talk to you." At that moment, I started to tremble, still frozen in place, while the man kept whispering that he wanted to give me something and to come closer. Then he said, "Wait a moment, don't go away, I'll show you." Then his head slowly disappeared behind the car, as if he was looking around for that something. But then I decided to take advantage of that moment to escape. I ran off down the sidewalk, but when I passed by the car, that's when I experienced the most terrifying moment of my life. As I sped past, I turned to look at the guy, and that's when I saw him and two other older men crouching behind the car and smiling disgustedly at me. But then I realized that the other two were completely naked, while he was wearing a completely ridiculous, but at the same time terrifying, ballet dancer costume. At that moment, I started screaming and running faster, but I could hear them running after me, which made me feel even more terrified. Although right now I'm not sure if they were really following me, or it was my childish imagination playing tricks on me because of how scared I was. The fact is that I arrived home hyperventilating, and with my whole body shaking. I slammed the door shut and started yelling at my sister, crying, and with my voice cracking, to call the police. She ran out of the room asking me like crazy what had happened to me, but all I could do was repeat over and over again that we had to call the police. Seeing my state of panic, my sister immediately reached for the phone and dialed 911, so I told the operator that naked old men were chasing me. She told me to lock all the doors and stay put until the police arrived. They arrived pretty quickly, but obviously the guys were already gone. The cops called my mother, who came running home. They asked me a few questions before they went around the neighborhood looking for these guys, but they never found them. More than 10 years have passed since this incident, and I never saw them again. I'm sure it wasn't from my condo, but I still wonder what would have happened if I had gone to where this man was calling me. I grew up in a small town in the north of England. It was that kind of place where everyone was in the know about everyone else's life, as there wasn't much entertainment. I guess gossip became the favorite pastime of most. Whether it was in the supermarket, pubs, playgrounds, or rugby stands, people always found an excuse to spill each other's deepest, darkest secrets. Just before I left for university in 2005, the most scandalous and poorly kept secret was that a teenager we'll call Andy, to protect his privacy, was dealing with clinical depression and had started to hurt himself. I had seen him walking around town several times. He had long hair that fell over his face and always wore long-sleeved shirts even in the summer. The local old ladies would shake their heads disapprovingly at the sight of him, muttering things like, "There he goes. He's probably going to buy drugs or razor blades." But I just watched him go in and out of the guitar store. And that particular day, I was thinking about the rugby match the Wales were playing in New Zealand, so one of our neighbors had set up a sort of movie theater in his garden, complete with a projector and everything. The idea was that everyone who didn't go to the 2 pubs in the village could gather at his house, enjoy a few drinks, and watch the rugby matches. At that time, I didn't really care about rugby, and I still don't, but it's very important in my country. What happened is that during halftime, that boy's father showed up at our neighbor's house for some reason. Then, very hurriedly, he turned to his wife and told her that he thought Andy was trying to commit suicide. It turned out that his bedroom door was locked and he didn't answer when they knocked. Andy's father tried to force the door open, but he wasn't exactly a very strong man, so he decided to run back to the party for help. Almost everyone at the party reacted immediately and rushed out to Andy's parents' house, and a couple of guys helped break down the door, only to find that no one was inside. In his confusion brought on by the beers, Andy's father hadn't thought to check the bedroom window, which his son had used to sneak out and meet his friends or something. But at that point, no one knew what had happened and the tension was palpable in the air. Almost everyone was in a panic, and when I say everyone, I mean the 60 people who left the party to try to save Andy's life, including the hosts, who ran out, leaving their 10-year-old son to take care of his 6-month-old baby sister. They were only supposed to be gone for a couple of minutes, so the little girl was in no danger, or so they thought. When the 10-year-old's parents finally returned home about 30 minutes later, they were met with a frightening scene. The mom screamed so loud and for so long that she fainted, falling and hitting her head on a dresser, not the least of which considering the scene she encountered at home. It turns out that, while they were out, her son, who was clearly not very well mentally, had spilled some of his juice on his little sister, but instead of getting a paper towel or anything reasonable to clean it up, he decided the best thing to do would be to stick it in the microwave and turn it on for 5 minutes. As I told you before, people in my town are pretty gossipy, and I didn't see this scene firsthand, so I have heard from many people who claim to have witnessed it, and I have heard some frighteningly graphic descriptions from them of what happened that terrifying. But nothing is more frightening than imagining the pain and shock of a mother encountering such a situation. There has been a lot of discussion about the child's intentions even though he was only 10 years old. Some argued that he knew exactly what he was doing, and that his attempt to dry her up was the family's way of trying to find some dignity again, passing it off as a tragic accident when, in reality, there was something much murkier at play. Others argue that there really was. However, as extreme as it sounds, those of us who knew this guy have good reason to think that certainly, maybe it wasn't an accident. But who knows? However, what really struck me about this, aside from the fact itself, which is chilling, was how the rumors about Andy had people running all over town looking for him, trying to break down doors and all that, when the biggest threat to everyone's safety turned out to be this kid who seemed so harmless. A kid his parents should never have left alone with a baby. The boy was moved to a juvenile psychiatric facility shortly after what happened, and the following year, his family moved to another part of England. I guess to escape those horrible memories. I feel sorry for them, I really do, but just the thought of that baby being put in that microwave makes my hair stand on end even today. When I was in high school in the early 2000s, I got together with a new group of friends. At the time, goth and emo were all the rage, and my new group was a mix of both. A friend Larry and I clicked right away. My home life wasn't the best, and Larry felt the same way. We both had siblings that our parents spoiled a lot, and we felt ignored all the time. He was a little weird at times, saying he was a Satanist, but no one took him seriously. Another friend, Demon, also claimed to be into that satanic stuff. In fact, I think his name wasn't really that, but he called himself that just because of his love of the occult, so it's no wonder he hit it off instantly with Larry. At that time, the three of us were inseparable, hanging out every afternoon, smoking weed and messing with people passing by in cars. We even once broke into the school at night and smashed a bunch of lockers. Typical rebellious and stupid teenage nonsense, but we found it hilarious. However, I started to see my friends differently after a party we went to. It was around Halloween, my senior year, October 2007. Larry had invited Demon and some other friends to a party at his house one weekend when his parents were away. We lived in a small town where nothing much was going on, but Larry lived in a more suburban area, a fairly nice new development, while the rest of us lived in simpler houses. Larry's house was large, had 2 floors, and apparently his family was well off. It was rare for a kid from that background to be emo. The party was typical: loud music, a little alcohol, weed, some pills. Larry promised everyone an incredible surprise for afterwards, so there were expectations, but no one was prepared for what would happen afterwards. Something I will never forget. It was about 11 p.m. when Larry and Demon told us all to go down to the basement. Larry's dad had turned it into a game room, something out of a 70s sitcom. We all gathered around the seating area, and my 2 best friends showed us the surprise they had inside a closet. It was a woman bound and gagged in a shirt. We all recognized her instantly. It was Emma, a homeless woman from town who collected cans and dabbled in drugs. She looked very confused and scared. "Larry, what the hell is this?" I asked, as the others looked at each other confused. "Jack helped us bring her in," Larry replied. "Let's have some fun tonight," he said with a lot of mischief on his face, as Demon grinned and handed out darts to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, with you our first event of the evening, the human dart board," Larry said loudly. "Really? What the hell is wrong with them?" asked a girl in the room, obviously outraged at what these 2 were trying to do. But she wasn't the only one. We were all in shock. This was too much, even for Larry. At that moment, ignoring everyone, Demon threw the first dart and stuck it in Emma's arm, who let out a muffled scream through the shirt in her mouth. I was completely horrified and very, very surprised because I had no idea they had done this, and that I kept going up and down with the 2 of them. "How the hell did you guys get her here?" I asked Larry. He said he and Demon had invited her and Jack to smoke and drink with them. Joak was another guy who lived on the street. He had the mind of a child, and Emma was an addict, so no wonder they took the deal. Apparently, Jack helped them tie Emma up and put her in the closet. She had been in there for a whole day and no one knew anything. Larry offered me a dart, saying, "Hey, don't be a party pooper, have fun." But of course I wouldn't do that. So, Larry shrugged his shoulders, took the dart he had offered me and threw it at Emma, hitting her just below the chest as she screamed in pain again. It was horrible and totally inhuman. Worst of all, some were even encouraged to participate in that twisted game. In the end, Emma had 12 darts stuck in her body. I refused to play at all times. All I wanted was to get out of that place as soon as possible. But Larry's older brother was blocking the only way out. He had been recording everything with his camera and threatened to show the video to our parents or the police if we tried to escape. Basically, he was blackmailing us. "Ready for the next game?" asked Demon very animatedly. Then he and Larry took Emma off the board and sat her in the middle of a chalk-drawn circle that Larry had made. Then they injected her with something that Michael said was heroin, but no one knew for sure. "Tonight we are going to sacrifice this innocent girl as the greatest offering to honor our Lord, the true King of Kings, Satan," shouted Larry to the crowd. At this point, some were completely horrified, while others had somehow been seduced by this macabre game and were now applauding and cheering the fact that this pair of psychopaths that I used to consider my friends were torturing this poor lost soul. Larry told Demon to pass the utensils, that Sean had them, and when Demon opened that black bag, we saw a bunch of knives. Some kitchen knives, some butter knives, you name it. It was crazy, totally twisted. Larry had done some weird stuff before, but this was too much. A blood sacrifice to please the king? What the fuck is wrong with their heads? At that moment, Demon grabbed a kitchen knife and gave Rose a small cut, and she moaned in pain, even though she was half knocked out from whatever had been injected into her. Some girls in the room were crying, and I was sick to my stomach. I was a little high, but I still knew this was crazy. What happened next made me feel so bad I almost threw up. Larry licked the blood off the knife. Blood from someone who had been on the street and maybe hadn't bathed in days or weeks. Then he and Demon kissed, sharing their offering. I knew Larry was playing both sides, but from Demon's behavior I really didn't expect it. Seriously, I regretted introducing those two. Now that it had started out as something weird, it had gotten too crazy, and suddenly everything got even more out of control. Others at the party also wanted their turn to cut Emma and lick her blood. They were some older guys and a girl. I had no idea who they were. The others of us, which were 2 boys and 3 girls, refused to get involved in all that. It was definitely total madness what we were witnessing. But suddenly someone whispered in my ear that she was going to call the police. It was a girl from my school, one of the few who had a cell phone, and she had it hidden in her purse. She said, "Please cover for me." While Emma was still screaming in terror, watching this group of deranged people licking their blood, I just stood there, hoping they wouldn't try to do something worse to her. "Please don't let them kill this woman," I kept repeating in my head. And while I was repeating this like a mantra, the girl was calling 911 and quietly telling the police where we were and what was going on. It was at that moment that I saw a giant knife rising up over Emma, and I screamed, "Stop! This is too much!" Larry's hand stopped in midair, and everyone looked at me in surprise, but seemed to be in some sort of trance and looked back at Emma. Then Larry said in his creepy voice that the blood was supposed to be a gift for the king, and I just wanted to ruin it. "Are you sure you want to piss off the king, Christy?" he said to me slowly and with a very creepy look on his face. Then he got up and started walking towards me slowly with the knife in his hand. Everyone was silent and just stared at him. Demon, who was behind him, looked at him a little cautiously and then looked at me. Then he walked behind Larry and told him that he didn't have to hurt me, that he should just ignore me and go on with the ritual sacrifice. But Larry had his eyes fixed on me now. He seemed to be like possessed by something as he kept walking slowly in my direction. But just as he was less than 2 meters away from me, the girl on the cell phone shouted, "The police are on their way!" And chaos ensued. My former Satanist friend dropped the knife and with the most pathetic, panicked face I've ever seen in my life, ran out the door, while the brother was the first one out, leaving the basement door open. Demon also ran out, leaving me alone in the basement with Emma and the girl who called the police. We had to protect her because now she was starting to shake and seemed to be having a seizure, probably a product of what they injected her with. A few minutes later, the police arrived. The girl and I told them everything that had happened, and fortunately an ambulance arrived and took Emma away. She survived, but after that we never saw her again in the city. I don't know what happened to her. On the other hand, Larry and Devin were arrested and sent to a juvenile detention center. After that, I graduated and completely cut off any ties with them. I even moved away for fear that they might try to look for me. You never know what people like that might do. Larry's dumb brother saved the footage on his camera, and the police used it to catch the others who were into that grotesque ritual, including other high school kids. The best advice I can give you is to be very careful of the people you surround yourself with. You never know how crazy someone who introduces themselves as your friend might be. This story begins many years ago when I was a kid living in an apartment with my dad and older brother in a town in Missouri. I used to hate going to bed early and would often sneak off to the living room to fool around. On one such night, I got out of bed and made sure my brother was still asleep. We shared a bunk bed, so it wasn't difficult. Then I walked quietly to the living room, left the bedroom door open each time, in case I had to run back to bed while playing in the living room, jumping on the couches and such. I noticed a black shadow from the balcony. I stopped dead in my tracks and looked out carefully. Then I saw a silhouette, a black figure standing near the door, right next to the handle. I was so startled that I ran back to bed and slammed the door shut. That woke Mike, who became concerned and asked me what was wrong. I told him what I saw, and he said he was going to go check. He opened the door, went out, and came back a minute later. He told me he hadn't seen anything, so everything must be fine. I accepted what my brother said and went back to bed, but later I woke up and realized that Mike had left the door open again. So I got up to close it myself, and just as I was about to touch it, it slammed shut. That got Mike's attention, and he woke up wondering what was going on. I told him what happened, and he looked confused. I was so scared that I asked to sleep with him, and he finally let me sleep with him. A while later, Dad came into our room and asked where all the noise was coming from. Then I told him what I had seen too, but he didn't seem to believe me. He thought the whole thing was silly and thought maybe one of us had slammed the door shut. Mike tried to say it was a draft, but Dad told him to get back into bed. He wasn't convinced, as he had left all the windows and the balcony door tightly shut, so he started questioning us about who had slammed the door. But as I was trying to explain again, we heard a loud noise coming from the living room. It sounded like another door had slammed shut. Dad ran out into the living room and turned on the light while Mike and I followed close behind. He started looking around. There are only two doors in the living room, the front door and the balcony door. He first checked the front door and saw that it was locked. Then he went to the balcony door and found it slightly ajar. He looked for a few seconds, trying to figure out why it had opened, but in the end he just closed it and locked it again. Then he sent us back to bed, and that was it for that night. We lived in that apartment for a few more years, and every once in a while I kept seeing that black figure and hearing a door slam. Sometimes the sofa pillows would move, but Dad always found a logical explanation for everything. Mike and I learned to ignore it. Then we moved to another house when Dad remarried, and it was a 2-story house. We thought it was time to start over, and it seemed like it. We had a dog and 2 cats, and everything was normal for a while, but one day my stepmother asked me if I had folded the dog's blanket. I told her no, I hadn't even touched it. She accepted my answer. But then she asked Mike, and he also said no, so I asked her what she was talking about since I was curious about her question. My stepmom explained that she had found the blanket perfectly folded on top of the washing machine. That was really weird because the dog slept on her bed on the floor and hated having the blanket taken away, so we only moved it to wash it, and she had just cleaned it. At that point, I was tempted to tell her about the figure I always used to see in our old apartment, but I didn't want her to take me for a fool or a liar. But what do you know? My stepmom wasted no time in thinking it was a ghost thing. She told me that she had seen ghosts before when she was younger, and that these things not only existed, but were sometimes able to materialize and do things like that. Dad, for his part, was still convinced that ghosts weren't real. He said that one of us had probably folded the blanket and just forgot. So we went about our routine, but that was just the beginning. A few days later, I started seeing that same black figure again. It was always next to an open door, right near the handle. I was starting to get really nervous because I had started sleeping with the door open so the cats could come in whenever they wanted. I was trying to ignore things and just sleep, but every time I heard the door creak, I was terrified. I always waited to feel my cats in bed before I dared to look. Then one night, while doing homework, I stayed up late and heard my door creak. I turned around without much thought. I just wanted to see my cat to relax a bit, but there it was, that black figure. My heart stopped. I was completely paralyzed, and after what seemed like an eternity, but I'm sure it was about 10 seconds, the door slammed shut. I started screaming like crazy, and my dad and stepmom showed up running to see what was going on. I told them everything I had seen, but Dad just thought I was tired and hallucinating. However, my stepmom heard me and told me to wait a moment. When she returned, she was with her rosary and hung it on my door handle, telling me that it would keep away what I had seen. She recommended that if I saw it again, to go straight to her. After what happened with the black figure, I started noticing strange things, but now in my mom's house, and this became a routine. Every day, almost like clockwork, I would start hearing creaking noises coming from the ceiling between 6 p.m. and 3 a.m. My mom and her partner ignored it, saying it was the house settling or something from the pipes, but Mike and I knew it was too strange that it always happened at those times. Then my dog started waking me up with growls, looking at the wall next to my bed. At first I didn't think much of it because it was common for him to bark and growl at the windows, but when I realized he was actually growling at the wall, it started to make me uncomfortable. Slowly I crawled out of bed and went to hug him. Then he stopped growling, sniffed me and looked at me, as if checking that I was okay, and once he seemed satisfied, he went back to growling at the wall. After a while, he stopped and sniffed me again before sitting down next to me. Finally, I went back to bed, and he put his head next to my pillow until I fell asleep. But then when my mom's second dog, a German Shepherd, grew big enough to come into my room, he also started growling at the same wall during the night. This was a very noisy dog, but he never barked for no reason, so, following his lead, I would get out of bed whenever he stopped growling, but that only affected my sleep. Finally, I decided to tell my stepmother what was going on, especially after a picture frame above my bed fell to the floor and broke. She told me that there was a spirit following me, and that I should be careful, as she believed it was becoming more active. Hearing that really scared me. I tried to go on with my life and pretend that the doors closing on their own and my dogs growling were nothing. Even my cats started behaving strangely in the house at times. I thought that if I just ignored all this, it would eventually go away, but I was very wrong. Sometime later, we moved back in. My stepmother told me to let her know the moment I saw anything strange again. After a few weeks, everything seemed quiet, until I started hearing voices. They sounded like people talking, but in a whisper, as if they were in distant rooms. I would always stop what I was doing to try to hear what they were saying, but every time I did, they went quiet. There were times when I was all alone in the house and I could hear what sounded like my dad talking to someone. I was completely confused. I was going to call him, but instead, I looked out the window and saw that his car was still gone. After that, I started hearing footsteps, as if someone was walking in my parents' room upstairs. The weirdest thing was that those footsteps sounded exactly like my dad's. He had a very particular way of walking, heavier and duller. I decided to mention it to my stepmother, and to my surprise, she told me that she had heard it too. She then told me that the sound was coming from her closet, and that sometimes she would come in and find boxes from the top shelf lying right in the middle of the floor. These episodes continued to recur over the next few years, but for the last 6 or 7 years or so, they have been diminishing, i.e., they don't occur as frequently. I never really knew what it was all about. I never knew who that spirit was, and I say that in the present tense because I still see it, but now very occasionally. Nowadays, I sleep with the door closed and locked, but sometimes I wake up and find it open. I really don't know what to do about it, and if anyone has any ideas, I would appreciate hearing any advice. I have always wanted to tell this story, although I was never sure I remembered all the details. It's just one of the many scary things that happened in this small town on La Tierra, where my father grew up. We had some pretty spooky experiences there, which would make for many stories, but this time I'll focus on what my grandfather told me. This happened to my great-grandfather when he was young and still residing in the village, before he moved to the United States as a worker in the automotive industry in the 1960s, maybe even a little earlier. His story became famous in town and is still told today as an urban legend. So listen. Back then, the town consisted of a few families who had small farms, and that's what they lived off of. My family still has olive groves, and back then, they were shepherds. When the working season came, many immigrants from other parts of Europe would come looking for work on the farms. My great-grandfather needed help, so he hired 5 boys to work as day laborers and in the fields. He offered them lodging in an old barn, where they spent the nights and prepared for long days of work. From that moment on, strange things began to happen in the village. Every couple of days, someone would find a dead sheep, and other farmers began to complain about their animals also turning up lifeless. There was a rumor, started by outside workers, that one of them always disappeared at night and returned very early in the morning, with a torn shirt or blood-stained clothes. My family didn't believe all that and blamed it on a stray dog or perhaps a wolf. In our area, we still have problems with those animals today. Stray dogs, when they come in packs, sometimes come to towns or beaches and attack whatever comes their way, whether it's a person or an animal. So one night, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and some of my father's uncles stayed awake, waiting for the animal to show up, armed and ready for anything. It was risky. Night in that part of the country fell fast, and once it got dark, you couldn't see anything within 3 feet of you. You could hardly see your hand in front of your face, so my grandfather and the others were watching the farm with torches. The sheep were restless, flocking together and running toward the noise. They were about to enter the barn, hoping to catch the troublemaker and give him his comeuppance. As they all patrolled, they noticed that the bushes next to the barn were a little too busy, of course. They suspected that a stray dog might be hiding there, but they weren't sure if it was one of the family either. So some of my father's uncles decided to go over to investigate. My grandfather thought it best to set up the shot in case it really was a dog. But as they approached the bush, suddenly the thing inside lost control. There was a loud rumbling sound, and it sounded like my great-uncle was being attacked by something. In the darkness, everything became complicated, and the torches did little to illuminate the scene. Everyone began to get upset, and the atmosphere became quite tense. Finally, one of the uncles told my grandfather to shoot now, so, without thinking too much, my grandfather acted fast and fired randomly into the bush. At that moment, everything went silent. A few seconds passed that seemed eternal, and then the bush moved again. My grandfather could just barely make out a figure running away, but it wasn't like a wolf. It looked more like a combination between a human and a wolf, as if a human was trying to be a wolf, or maybe a real werewolf. My grandfather told me it was very scary, but the real terror was about to come. When the scare passed, everyone went to check on my father's uncle, and to their complete horror, he turned out to be bleeding from the chest, and upon getting a better look at him, they realized he had a gunshot wound. Somehow grandfather's bullet had hit him. He was immediately taken to town, where he was treated at the local medical center and the bullet was removed. Fortunately, The bullet did not pass through any major organs, although it passed very close to the heart. The great-uncle was very lucky to survive the incident. The next day, while investigating the site, they noticed a huge rock in the bushes. The conclusion they came to is that my grandfather had probably mistaken the rock for something else, and upon firing, the bullet ended up hitting that rock, ricocheting and embedding itself right into the right side of my great-uncle's chest. The next day, they discovered that another sheep had been attacked inside the barn, which coincided with the strange disappearances of the migrant worker who never reappeared. A lot of things began to be discussed in the village. Some said it could be a werewolf, while others dismissed it as a disease that had caused a stir in the area. At the time, it was called werewolf sickness, and it was a mental condition where people behaved strangely during the night, attacking animals and even people during their outbursts. My father is convinced that what happened was real, regardless of who or what the attacker really was. When he was little, he used to hear about this story from his grandfather, and I remember that his uncle once went to visit them, and on one of those visits, he asked him if he could see the scar that my great-grandfather's bullet left on his chest, and my great-uncle unbuttoned his shirt to show a rather noticeable scar on his right breast.